In the heart of Africa lies a land that dared to defy empires and became a symbol of resilience for generations. Ethiopia, one of the few African nations to resist colonial rule, stood as an unyielding fortress against European imperialism. Its independence didn't just preserve a single nation's freedom, it lit a spark that fueled the Pan-African movement and inspired Africans worldwide in their fight for dignity, justice, and self-determination. In the heart of Africa lies Ethiopia, an ancient land with a rich cultural and historical tapestry that stretches back thousands of years. As one of the few African nations to have never been colonized, Ethiopia stood as a beacon of freedom and resistance against the tide of European imperialism. But beyond its borders, Ethiopia's independence had a profound impact on the wider African continent, influencing the Pan-African movement and inspiring generations of Africans to fight for their own liberation. The story of Ethiopia's role in the Pan-African struggle is one of resilience, pride, and a deep sense of justice. To fully understand its significance, we must first delve into the turbulent era of colonialism in Africa. By the late 19th century, European powers had divided most of Africa into colonies, subjecting the peoples of the continent to brutal exploitation. The scramble for Africa had begun in earnest, with nations like Britain, France, Belgium, and Italy carving up the continent for their own benefit. The African people, though diverse in culture and language, were united in their suffering under colonial rule. Yet, amidst this darkness, Ethiopia remained an uncolonized land, fiercely resisting external powers. The country's ability to preserve its independence was a source of immense pride, particularly under the leadership of Emperor Menelik II. His victory over the invading Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 was nothing short of historic. The Italian army, one of the most powerful in Europe, had underestimated the military capabilities of the Ethiopian forces, led by Menelik II. In a decisive and stunning defeat, Ethiopian forces crushed the Italians, forcing them to retreat. The Battle of Adwa not only preserved Ethiopia's sovereignty, but also became a symbol of African resistance to colonialism. News of Ethiopia's victory spread like wildfire across the African continent. It was a moment of hope, a rare glimmer of light in the face of centuries of colonial domination. For the African people, Ethiopia's victory at Adwa was a vindication of their struggle for dignity and self-determination. It demonstrated that colonial powers were not invincible and that the dream of independence could become a reality. Ethiopia's triumph became a rallying cry for Africans across the world who longed for freedom. One of the most significant ways Ethiopia's independence influenced the Pan-African movement was through the establishment of the First Pan-African Congress. In 1900, African leaders from across the continent and the diaspora gathered in London for the first time to discuss the issues of colonialism, racism, and the need for African unity. Among the most notable figures at this Congress was W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American scholar and activist who believed in the potential for African nations to rise together against imperialism. Du Bois, inspired by Ethiopia's independence and Menelik II's victory, would go on to become one of the most prominent voices in the Pan-African movement. The Pan-African Congress laid the groundwork for future movements advocating for African unity and independence. But it was not just the political and intellectual leaders who were inspired by Ethiopia's example. The African diaspora, particularly in the United States, began to rally around Ethiopia as a symbol of freedom and pride. The Marcus Garvey movement, for example, drew heavily on Ethiopia's example as it sought to inspire African Americans and others of African descent to embrace their heritage and fight for their liberation. Garvey, a Jamaican-born activist, promoted the idea of a united Africa, and Ethiopia became the spiritual and political center of his vision. Garvey's famous Back to Africa movement sought to encourage people of African descent worldwide to return to their ancestral homeland. Ethiopia, with its long history of independence, became the focal point of this movement. In the early 20th century, Ethiopia's significance went beyond political symbolism. It became the embodiment of the hopes and dreams of all Africans who sought liberation. The desire to reclaim African identity and self-determination was further amplified by the example set by Ethiopia. As the Pan-African movement gained momentum throughout the 20th century, Ethiopia remained a crucial source of inspiration. In 1935, however, Ethiopia faced its greatest test. The country was invaded once again, this time by fascist Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. The Italian invasion was brutal, and despite Ethiopia's valiant resistance, the country was eventually occupied. The fall of Ethiopia was a devastating blow to the Pan-African movement, but it did not extinguish the flame of resistance. Instead, it galvanized further efforts for African liberation, with many Pan-African leaders rallying to Ethiopia's cause. The Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie I, became a global figure during this time, embodying the struggle for freedom not just for Ethiopia, but for all of Africa. He appealed to the League of Nations, calling for international intervention against Italy's aggression. Though his appeal was met with inaction by the international community, Selassie's leadership and courage became a symbol of African defiance. His voice echoed across the world, demanding justice for Ethiopia and for all African nations struggling under the weight of colonialism. After Ethiopia's eventual liberation in 1941, Haile Selassie would become a central figure in the Pan-African movement. He helped establish the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. A platform for African nations to work together to rid the continent of colonialism and promote economic and political unity. The OAU would play a pivotal role in the independence movements that swept across Africa in the mid-20th century, culminating in the liberation of many African nations from colonial rule. Ethiopia's independence also had a profound impact on the ideological foundations of Pan-Africanism. The ideals of self-determination, unity, and solidarity that had been championed by Ethiopia during the colonial era became the core principles of Pan-African movements. Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania drew inspiration from Ethiopia's long history of resistance and independence. Ethiopia's independence showed them that African nations could indeed govern themselves, and that unity was essential to achieving the political and economic goals of African liberation. Haile Selassie's legacy as a Pan-Africanist leader extended far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. He became an icon for African unity, and his influence was felt in movements that spanned the globe. The Rastafarian movement, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, embraced Haile Selassie as a divine figure, representing the liberation of the African people. The movement became a cultural force that spread throughout the Caribbean, Africa, and the world, and Ethiopia remained at its spiritual center. Ethiopia's role in Pan-Africanism was also reflected in the political and cultural movements that followed the independence of African nations in the 1960s and 1970s. African leaders, inspired by Ethiopia's example, sought to create a continent united in its fight for economic independence, political sovereignty, and cultural renewal. The influence of Ethiopia on the Pan-African movement cannot be overstated, as it was not just a symbol of resistance, but a living testament to the possibilities of freedom. Even today, Ethiopia's legacy continues to inspire Pan-African thinkers, activists, and leaders. Its historical role as a beacon of freedom, standing strong against the forces of colonialism and imperialism, remains a powerful reminder of the potential for unity and self-determination. As Africa continues its journey toward political and economic unity, Ethiopia's influence remains a guiding force for the continent's future. Ethiopia, The land that defied colonial domination continues to stand as a symbol of hope and strength for Africa and the world. Its legacy is not just one of survival, but of triumph. A triumph that ignited the Pan-African spirit and showed the world that Africa's freedom was not just a dream, but a reality waiting to be realized. The influence of Ethiopia's independence on the Pan-African movement is a testament to the power of one nation to inspire an entire continent and to light the way toward a future of freedom, dignity, and unity for all Africans.